Outlining Presentations, Chapter 12, in our open text textbook, Business Communication for Success. Organizing and planning presentations. So here are the guided lecture notes that you have for this chapter. To summarize and simplify, we're going to go over the rhetorical situation. We want to make sure that you understand pathos, logos, and ethos, which you've heard about in other classes most likely. We're going to talk about the 5-finger model and your transitions. So to give you an idea of rhetorical situation, let's talk about Julius Caesar, since we'll next be talking about the Greek ethos, pathos, and logos. He was a Roman statesman. He was eventually emperor of Rome, but the time that we're talking about, he was a general, and he became an author who was famous for the conquest of Gaul, which is modern France and Belgium. But here's the interesting thing. He was sent away from Rome because he was gathering too much power. And the leaders thought if he was away in a time where there was no television, no radio, he wouldn't be able to amass more power in the nation state of Rome. However, Julius Caesar decided to write commentaries about his action in Gaul in the third person. And he had daily news bulletins in the Acta Diurna, the first newspaper, posted in the Forum and other public places that were read aloud. And so by writing in the third person, where he doesn't say, I did this, but he says, he did this, Julius Caesar bravely did this or that, he actually sounded as if he was an impartial judge talking about the heroic, amazing general Julius Caesar. And the people of Rome literally heard about Julius Caesar every single day. He took social media in an entirely new direction long ago. He became monarch by coup d'etat, and he laid foundations for the Roman Empire. So Julius Caesar was able to convey a message even from afar by making some strategic choices in a strange rhetorical situation where he had to really think, how do I keep myself in the public view? So the opening demonstration that we would do in class is to show you this September 2019 speech by Bill Gates and others about the status of Apple. And what I really want to focus on, and we don't even need to see this, but I would like you to click on it and watch that first minute and 40 seconds, because that's where he uses an attention getter that's not him talking at all. It's a specially created graphic, an introduction, that shows graphically the history of Apple leading into their current developments. It's clean, it's attractive, and it is compelling. In fact, if you watch the conclusion and residual message of 1 hour and 39 minutes, which is filled with words, while the introduction has no words, it's only graphics, you'll discover that that introduction in many ways stands alone. The rest of it is just a lot of talking and selling. So if you want to click here, really watch that riveting graphic history. And think about your own rhetorical situation and what matters. Why were the hour and 40 minutes that followed done, but they didn't have much meaning? And where will your presentation be viewed? Who's going to look at it? And what are they going to remember? Are they going to remember the first thing you did? Shift your focus from your own needs to your audience's needs. That means you shift from an internal focus to an external focus. And definitely think about ethos, your own credibility. Remember how Julius Caesar built his credibility by talking about himself impartially. Well, I don't want you to use the third person, but I do want you to think about what sources you use that help build your credibility. Because if your credibility is weak, then your argument is weak. Think about pathos, or the heart, the emotional reaction you're stirring from your audience. Why does this matter? And then think about the argument itself. Because you're in business school, because you're in a university, the strongest element of your presentation should be the argument itself. Does this make sense? So when you look at this article, you might think, looking at ethos, pathos, and logos, okay, what's missing here? And you read it and you see a lot of technical terms and you think about it. You see the pictures. Well, in this rhetorical situation, it's a vaping research letter directed to the editor at the New England Journal of Medicine. Would it change your mind? Well, think about whether the letter itself is intended for you. If it's not, who is it intended for? Who reads the New England Journal of Medicine? What do they consider to be important? So is it ethos, pathos, or logos? Are they looking for an emotional reaction? Could it be successful? Right. The people reading the New England Journal of Medicine are not necessarily looking for a strong emotional reaction. They're looking at the credibility of the speaker, and they're looking at the argument itself and their own goals. So this probably could be successful in that form, in that rhetorical situation. Might not be successful when speaking to a group of college students. So the 5-finger model. Hold up your hand and look at your 5 fingers. Now, the thumb, that's your attention statement. So hold your thumb. You always begin with something that is important to the audience, whether that's a question, whether that's an example, whether that's a point about the significance of what you're going to talk about. Begin with something that matters to the audience. That is their first memory of you, and that signals to them whether they should be paying attention or not. Your pointer finger, this is your introduction. What are you doing? At this point, you might want to give an overview. If you are in a business setting, having an overview slide that talks about what you are going to discuss in your presentation itself, the sections, is important. It shows that you're organized and that you're on track. Your middle finger is the body of your presentation. It's important, it's valuable, and yet it is less likely to be remembered in some ways than the beginning and the end. Then we have your 4th finger, that's your conclusion, and finally your pinky finger, the residual message. Again, why does this matter to your audience? What is their takeaway? What do you want them to take away from this presentation and remember? You should be able to know all 5 fingers, and when I talk about the 5-finger model, you should be able to identify each one and the role it plays. So here's another way to remember it. And let's think about what you've been taught in the past. You've been taught for speeches, introduction, tell them what you're going to tell them, body, tell them, conclusion, tell them what you told them. That still holds true. You just add the other 2 critical elements of capturing their attention. That ties into primacy. People remember the first thing that they see very well. And then recency. The last thing that they see is often what they take away, and that's your residual message at the end. So here are the roles of the introduction. You want to capture listeners' attention, get them involved, identify yourself and build your credibility, state your thesis, preview your main points, and I encourage everyone to always have an agenda slide on your visual aid. Always. So if you take a look at this slide, you'll see a slide that actually has a couple of problems. I think that it's a very good introduction, and I think this slide is better. Do you see why it's better when we were talking about visual aids? So this is the better slide of the 2 that I created. And Julius Ch does a very good job of talking about the 3 reasons we still haven't gotten rid of malaria. And the first sentence of that introduction is, so, over the long course of human history, the infectious disease that's killed more humans than any other is malaria. This is from a TED Talk, and when you look at your PDF, you can click the link, or you can just Google it and find Julius Ch doing this TED Talk, and I think she does an excellent job. How can you capture attention? Well, you can state a startling fact like Julius Ch did. You can ask a rhetorical question, like, in this case, if you could end for good the disease that has killed more human beings than any other disease, would you? So that might be a very good question to ask about malaria. You could tell a joke, but in this case, in this rhetorical situation, that's not a good idea. You could tell a story. Sometimes we use quotations. Be careful. It's too easy to use a quotation sometimes. Make sure it fits, make sure it's highly appropriate, and it's the best choice to capture attention. Or you could offer a promise. You could say at the beginning, I'm not trying to sell you something, but I promise if you do buy today, you have 100 years to return this product and get a new one. Wow, if you made that promise at the beginning of a presentation, I might watch the entire presentation before, for a sales presentation. That might be exactly what I need to hear. So think about the types of outlines. There are working outlines that are brainstorming. There are formal outlines, which is often what you turn in, that are written out completely. And there are keyword outlines. These are your speaking notes. So what speech is Abraham Lincoln most famous for? It's the Gettysburg Address. And why was that valuable? Well, it's only 272 words, but there were 5 documented edits. So even a short speech of 2 to 3 minutes long can be edited extensively and should be. So even if you're only speaking for a minute or two, I expect to see all 3 of these outlines and you to have a very good sense of where you're going. That doesn't mean you memorize it word for word, but you might write it out word for word just to make sure that all the pieces go together. So you would have all 3 of these types. You'd brainstorm it, you'd write out a formal outline, and then you'd get your speaking notes and practice. At that point, you might even move things around a little bit based on how they work when you're presenting. Know that the situation, the rhetorical situation, makes a big difference. So even if you've given a speech in the past, you may want to update it. The Gettysburg Address was given 4 months after a pivotal, costly battle of Gettysburg. And there were other speeches given that day, including speeches of more than an hour that no one remembers. So a short speech can be more effective than a longer speech. So outlining. We expect you to outline because it's an aspect of strategy. It helps the speaker sort through ideas, reveals thought processes, highlights omissions or mistakes. You can determine whether you need additional research, and you can enhance the effectiveness of delivery. I want you to continuously evolve that outline. Keep working on it as you prepare your speech. So, strategically pick your pattern of organization for the speech itself, and consider the symmetry of your speech. Each speaker's portion should be balanced and should be about the same amount, and they should be of equal weight, dealing with things that are of equal significance. I'm going to determine the appropriate number of main ideas and consider their placement and order. So I mentioned primacy and recency, and I connected them to the ideas of, on the 5-finger model, the attention getter and the kind of closing statement, residual message. So what does that mean? That the audience remembers things best that they see first and that they see last. So you can see here, audience attention, where does it flag? Flags in the body. So if you want the audience to be more interested and invested in the body, you've got to treat it a little bit more like the attention getter and like the takeaway, and give the audience reasons to pay attention. Make it important to that audience. Here's an example of how you might begin an outline in terms of what you need to do. So think about what your goals are and what the actual presentation needs to do and what it's going to do. When you're structuring the body, focus on a limited number of main points. Develop each point with adequate explanation and details, and use a clear organizational strategy. So you might go in time and show a change over time, or you might go with the most compelling reason first. Here are some organizational strategies: chronology, change over time; geography, where you look at the situation in terms of a place. So you may start in your town and then move outward. Topic, function, or conventional grouping. You might do a comparison contrast. Let's choose this idea. What happens then? Let's choose that idea. What happens then? You may look at it in terms of journalism. You may talk about value or size. You may begin, and this is a really great way to... You may talk about the problem the business is having, and your solution or potential solutions. You might begin with a best case scenario in response to an evolving situation, and then a worst case scenario. Let's talk about transitions as connectives. So as you're building your presentation, you want to think about the different parts and how you're going to connect them to make them make sense. The types of transitions that you are most likely to use are signposts, internal previews, internal summaries, and rhetorical questions. There are 13 other types of transitions in the book that I expect you to look over, but these are the most common transitions, these 4. So what are signposts? They're verbal markers that signal a shift in focus. So when you organize your ideas and say first, second, third, this signals to your audience that these are main points that all have equal weight. Internal previews are where you alert your audience as to what you're going to cover next and why it's important. Internal previews are mini introductions. They give a glimpse of the point to come. They set the stage for the upcoming section. They look like detailed signposts, and they tell where you're going in the speech. Internal summaries are little mini conclusions for each section. So each speaker might have a little bit of an introduction and a conclusion, or you may use those internal previews and internal summaries as part of your transition from one speaker to the next. Internal summaries, these mini conclusions, maybe after you've presented something, you remind people of why it's important, provide helpful elaboration. They review what's been covered briefly, and they keep the audience on track. So rhetorical questions. You've heard about rhetorical questions before. You've asked rhetorical questions before. They highlight movement and they assist flow. So they move the audience through your points. 17 of our sons and daughters have already died in gang-related crime. How many will it take before we act? So this moves your audience towards the desired call to action, right? It encourages listener involvement. It stimulates thought without needing a verbal response. So if you're speaking to a group of 400 or 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 people, you can ask a question that gets people to think and gets them more involved without necessarily having them answer aloud. And rhetorical questions engage emotions. So at a political rally, someone might say, what have they ever done to help us? So people can get angry that it asks a question that the answer is to get everyone more engaged, more focused, more angry, more powerful, more sad, even more happy. When you cite in a speech, you increase your credibility. So cite the last name of the author, the year of publication, and you might even include the type of source, particularly if it increases your own credibility. So you might say, according to a 2020 article in the New York Times by Charles Brown, and then you say what you're going to say. Why should you cite quality sources? Well, once you start not citing quality sources, your credibility diminishes. And when you do cite quality sources, then your audience understands that you've done the research, that you've worked to get to your conclusion. So use quality sources to increase your credibility with your audience. So in conclusion, or talking about the conclusion, you want to summarize the presentation's thesis, review the main points. You want to leave the audience with that specific noteworthy takeaway at the very end, the residual message. You'll include that statement or closing thought, residual message, but the best thing you can do is with the residual message, loop it back to your introduction. Why not use a residual message that ties to how you got the audience's attention in the first place? Here are your guided lecture notes. So think about those. You need to be able to do all of this, and definitely look at that table in your book. Note where we're not going to test.
Thank you for your time today. If just a few changes to your organization increase your audience's attention, why not make them? Please incorporate these strategies.